Let's now take a look at how we would handle file input or output if we want to read stuff from a file or even write to a file. So let's say we're dealing with a large amount of data. It's going to be a lot more appropriate if we use files instead of trying to use a keyboard and a monitor to handle our input and output. So what is a file? Well, it's basically an area in our secondary storage that we use to hold information. I'm sure you've done stuff with files before, whether it's like Word documents for writing a paper for a class, maybe Excel files for spreadsheets, or maybe files that handle data for games. But we use files for a lot of different programs, so we need to know how we can read stuff from a file and how we can write data to a file. So if we're going to do file input, then we're still going to use the scanner class, but we're going to create a different object of the scanner class. So we've done one where we use the keyboard for input. So that was the system.in setup. That was that standard. So we're going to create a separate scanner object where the purpose of this object is to handle reading data from files. Now, if we're going to create such an object, we are going to need another class. We're going to need the file reader class, and this is located in the java.io package. So it's just worth noting that since this is not the java.lang package, we're going to have to import this package along with the java.util package if we want to do any file reading. To explain the file reader class, we're going to use the file input.txt as just kind of an example of an input file. So in order to create such an object, we're going to use the statement scanner in file equals new scanner, and then in that parentheses, we're going to have new file reader, and then in that parentheses, we're going to have input.txt. Okay, so what does this all mean? Well, in file is just the name of the object we're going to use. So just like how we had console as our name of the object for our console scanner, so we had for our system.in, we can use the name infile or any other name that we want for handling our file input. And then the last part of it, so what we put in the parentheses for scanner, we used new file reader input.txt. So this is very different than system.in. So remember, system.in takes care of keyboard input. So if we want to do files, we would just simply create a new object of the file reader class. So that's where the new file reader part comes into this setup. And in parentheses, we would put the name of the file. So in this case, it would be input.txt. So basically just use this line, and then whatever file you're going to use, you would just put that in place of input.txt, and that will take care of creating our file reader object. Now, in order to make that line actually work, the file must exist beforehand. So in our example, there must be an input.txt file. Otherwise, we're going to get what's called an exception. In this case, it's going to be called a file not found exception. Now, what's an exception? Well, for now, all we need to know is it's a runtime error. Something went horribly wrong while running the program. And we'll take a look at different types of exceptions in this course. But file not found exception means that we tried to use the file reader and the name of the file that we were trying to find just did not exist where we were currently looking. Now, the thing about this particular exception is that Java requires us to throw the exception. What do you mean by throw an exception? It means to handle it. It has to, if this exception happens, it has to do certain steps in order to handle it, or if it's going to act accordingly, which in most cases means it's going to terminate. So the way we do this is we include the line throws file not found exception, and we put it immediately after main, and this is before the curly brace. We'll take a look at an example in just a minute on how this is placed, but you basically would have your public static void main string args, and then after that close parentheses you would say throws file not found exception. And this is just giving the computer or the program a heads up saying we're going to be looking for a file. It's possible that the file is not there, so just be ready for it. Now, once we have this working, the good news is we can use the exact same input methods for infile as we did for our console object. So like, for example, I can do infile.nextInt, and that will read an integer from a file instead of from the keyboard. Now, what about outputting data to a file? If we want to do that, we have to use a different class, which is called the PrintWriter class. Just like with the FileReader class, this is also in the java.io package. So we don't have to worry about including any additional packages if we want to either read from a file or write to it. We can just use the same package for both. The syntax for this would be PrintWriter outFile equals new PrintWriter output.txt, where output.txt is our example output file. Now, unlike the file reader, if this file does not exist, we're not going to get an exception. The program will just automatically create the file for us. So we don't have to worry about checking if this file exists. But for input files, they have to exist before we can read from them. For output files, if they don't exist, our program will just automatically create that for us. And then once we've created our PrintWriter object, then we can just use the same methods that are associated with system.out. So for example, I can do outfile.println and then output the string test. I can do outfile.print. I can do outfile.printf. So any output methods that we've used before when we were trying to output something to the terminal, we can use those exact same methods for our outfile object. Finally, when we're done with our reading and writing on our files, we have to use a close method to close the files. When we use the file reader and the PrintWriter methods, we technically open the files for either reading or writing. And we have to close the files to say that we're done using them before we close our program. This is even a bigger deal with our PrintWriter, because if we don't close the file before closing the program, our data is not going to get written to the file. So if you write a program and you say you're going to write some stuff, you exit and you don't see anything in your file, it's probably because you forgot to close it. Now, fortunately, these are very simple methods. So like if I want to close my input file, I can just say infile.close. And if I want to close my output file, I can just say outfile.close. Here's an example of a program that does file input and output. So this program is going to read text from a file that's called input.txt. We're then going to do some stuff with it, and we're going to output that data to the screen and also to a file called output.txt. So let's take a look at all the components. So we have our import statements. Since we're going to be reading and we need the scanner class, we're going to need java.util.star. And because we're doing file operations, or at least reading and writing, we need java.io.star. We called our class file. We can call it whatever we want. We have our main. And since we are doing file IO, we need to include the throws file not found exception handler as part of our main, because it is possible that our input.txt file does not exist. So we have to include this line. If I don't include it, I'm going to get a compile error. So then we create our file input and output objects. So we're going to use infile and outfile as the names. So we do scanner infile equals new scanner, and then we include this new file reader part. So this is the part that actually opens up the input file. So we're going to look for input.txt. So let's make sure it does exist in our folder. So that should be this one right here. Yep. This is the folder that's going to have our program. So here's our file.java, and then here's our input file. So yeah, we're going to have West Virginia Mountaineers 540. Yes, I am a WVU fan. Deal with it. But this is going to be our text file. So input.txt does exist, so we should be fine there. Then we have our PrintWriter, which is called outfile, and we just set it to a new PrintWriter, and we use output.txt. Notice that there is no output.txt here. That is fine, because remember, what will happen is when I run this program, Java will create that file for us. It's only input files where we need to have the file created ahead of time. So then we're going to declare a couple variables. So some strings, some integers, because we're going to read some strings and some integers. We're then going to read our data. So we're going to do 3 reads for strings. So infile.next 3 times. So we're going to read West Virginia Mountaineers. So team name 1 and team name 2 are West Virginia. Mascot would be Mountaineers. And then we're just going to say we're going up against Pitt. Why not, right? So we do infile.next int, and that stores the first number in WView score. And remember, this infile here is our scanner object. So it works just like console. The only difference now is that we're reading contents from a file instead of system.in. That's the whole difference here. But as we said before, when we use in-file object, we can use next, next int, next line, next double, and so forth. So all those methods are available to us when we're reading from files. We're then going to output to the screen. So we just use our system.out.print line. So we'll print the team, our score, or I should say WVU score, and then Pitt score. And then we're going to do the same thing, except now we're going to print the data to a file. So instead of system.out, we just use out file, and then print line and print and so forth. And then as we just said before, when we're done with the file, we need to close it. So we need to do infile.close, and we need to do outfile.close. So let's go ahead and compile and run this program and see what actually happens. So we'll go ahead and compile, make sure everything works. Compilation completed. There are no errors in here, which is good. So let's go ahead and run this. So we'll click on run, and here's our output. So WVU team, West Virginia Mountaineers, WVU score 54, Pitt score 0. We like those scores. Yes, we do. If you're a Pitt fan, sorry, I'm sorry. No, not sorry. Anyway, so this is what's output to the screen. So now let's take a look at our folder, and sure enough, here's our output.txt. And it says WVU team, West Virginia Mountaineers, WVU score 54, Pitt score 0. So sure enough, this does output our text to a file called output.txt. So this sure enough does read data from a file. We do some stuff with it, and we output it to the screen, and we output it to a file.